Alright, so here in this podcast I'm going to show you that rational choice theory and game theory aren't simply, academic exercises. They actually can be used to learn about and address important substantive issues in political science, and maybe garner some new insights into these. So I'll do so by looking at the paper by Richard Snyder on lootable wealth and political disorder. So he wants to uh, understand the relationship between what he calls lootable wealth and political disorder. Okay, so we'll look at introduction, then Snyder's argument, and then outcomes in Burma and Sierra Leone, which he uses as sort of case studies to sort of test his theory, or to not really test it, but to sort of illuminate or illustrate it. So Snyder asks, okay, does lootable wealth breed disorder? This goes back to all the literature surrounding what's called the resource curse, and the resource curse is essentially the idea that, if you go back to say the 50s and the 60s, there is this belief amongst many in the development community, in the economic development community, the political science community, that many of the states and the regimes that came out of the post-colonial, the colonial era, so in early years of post-colonialism, would do well, because it was argued they had a vast treasure trove of natural resources: oil, diamonds, timber, etc. And it seemed that many countries that were newly independent states in Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond, had the foundation in terms of their resources for economic growth and economic development. By the 70s or 80s, it was obvious that there was something wrong with this. That in fact, contrary to the hypotheses or the predictions of modernization theory, many of these regimes, in fact, didn't grow. They didn't develop economically as well as other states. And states, for instance, like the Asian Tigers, Thailand, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, which in comparison, comparatively, had very few resources, in fact grew astonishingly well, while many countries and states that had abundant resource wealth grew very slowly over the same period. So there came to be this came to be known as the resource curse. Rather than resources being a blessing, they became a curse, and countries that were cursed with having a large amount of resources were also cursed by lack of economic growth, lack of democracy, and what Snyder wants to show here, lack of political disorder or civil war violence. So Snyder starts the article by saying, okay, does lootable wealth, or in other words, resources, natural resources, does it breed political disorder? Well, he goes back to the conventional wisdom definition of lootable wealth, which are lucrative, easy to transport resources: gems, tropical timber, illicit drugs, right? And the conventional argument, which says that, in fact, these kinds of resources, this lootable wealth, generates disorder by supplying both the motive and the means for armed rebellion. So this is sort of the kind of the mechanism that links the presence of lootable wealth to political disorder. Okay. Now, what is the evidence? Well, there's belief of a strong statistical association between lootable resources and political disorder, and then also anecdotal evidence, right? You've heard of the blood diamonds. There's a relatively famous Hollywood movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio about blood diamonds in Sierra Leone. The logs of war in Cambodia and Liberia, narco guerrillas, of course, in Colombia. And now, what does Snyder say about the strength of this association? Okay, I mean, we see the anecdotal evidence, and we have some sort of idea of the association. Well, his answer essentially can be summarized in this table. Here we have instances of civil war, or that we have lootable wealth and civil war. So what we see is, okay, is there an empirically strong relationship between the presence of lootable wealth in the form of resources such as AD, which are alluvial diamonds, O is oil, TT is tropical timber, and civil war? His sort of definition of political disorder is civil war. Now, what we see is, yes, in sometimes these resources, this lootable wealth, does contribute to, there is civil war present in countries which have this type of wealth. So, for instance, in Angola, there were alluvial diamonds, and there was civil war between 1961, and it was ongoing as of 1999. But Guinea, which is also has a lot of alluvial diamonds, there was no civil war. Neither in Namibia. There was in Sierra Leone, South Africa, no, and etc. etc. So what he finds is that in the presence of lootable wealth, it's just as likely that there is civil war as there is not civil war. So it's not a very strong statistical relationship, and it's pretty much random. Okay, now here we find that as well. Okay, so what's the upshot of this? Well, the upshot is that Snyder claims that there's a lack of a theory that can explain the quote-unquote resource curse, right? Why, in other words, he's arguing, well, why is it that sometimes lootable wealth is linked with chaos and civil war and order in some others? Okay, why is it that sometimes we have civil war and other times we don't in the presence of lootable wealth? Okay, so Snyder then argues, well, it's about institutions of extraction. Remember his definition of, he changes his definition of lootable wealth a little bit to a more economic definition. In other words, he argues that lootable wealth are high-value goods with low economic barriers to entry. And an economic barrier to entry is simply a way of saying how much capital do you need to set up shop in that industry. So for instance, if you want to get into the automotive industry, the answer is a lot of capital. Billions of dollars are needed. And as a result, there's a high economic barrier to entry to that economic enterprise. Now, dredging gold or alluvial diamonds, on the other hand, all you need is really a pickaxe and a shovel, and you can essentially get started in that industry. Okay, and the value and the goods are very high value. Okay, so they can be sold. A small weight of gold of goods can be sold for very high value. So this is what he deems lootable wealth. Now, in Snyder's theory is simply, look, different types of institutions of extraction can be constructed on such goods with contrasting consequences for political stability. Okay, so different institutions of extraction lead to different levels of political stability. Okay, what does he mean? Well, so institutions of extraction. So what he's arguing is that if rulers are able to forge institutions of extraction which give them some control of the revenue at least, then this can contribute to political stability. Okay, but if there's a breakdown or the absence of such institutions, right, instability is produced, and there's two ways. First of all, there's a fiscal crisis, right? The state then isn't able to gain the rents or the monetary value from those resources, and it leaves the state vulnerable to collapse. And it also makes it easier for the rebels to organize, right? If the state can't monopolize the extraction of these high wealth, high value lootable resources, then rebels or private actors then can organize, and then the state is less able to maintain its monopoly on legitimate use of violence. Okay, now he argues that there are four types of institutions of extraction, as you know: private, public, joint, and no extraction. Okay. So private extraction is simply where private economic actors, like rebel groups, other groups that challenge the state, where they enjoy exclusive, unregulated control of the income that's generated by these resources, and thereby denying rulers a share of the wealth. Okay. Public extraction, of course, is the opposite, where rulers have a monopoly on the extraction process and they fully control the income generated by those resources. Joint extraction, well, it's when both. And this can take a variety of forms, from public taxation of privately extracted resources to things like government-run production rackets. And then finally, there's no extraction. Often there's no extraction. Why? Well, because rulers are unable to achieve control of resources by themselves. But then they also face strong incentives, of course, to try to prevent the private actors from extracting, because the accumulation of wealth and power by private actors may pose a threat. Right? So, and depending on a ruler's capacity, right, to deny private actors independent access to resources, a situation of no extraction can result, right? If oftentimes a state and rulers aren't strong enough to impose public extraction or even joint extraction, but they have at least some capacity to prevent rebel groups and other private actors from engaging in private extraction. Okay.